Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the cooperative chat put on by the National Association of Housing Cooperatives. This chat is a monthly or bi-monthly chat with someone involved in the cooperative housing world. And we hope to promote cooperative housing overall. And today's guest on Cooperative Chat is Andy Reicher. Andy is the Executive Director of the Urban Homesteaders Assistance Board in New York, UHAB. He has been the director of UHAB, Executive Director of UHAB since 1981. And under his tenure, the UHAB has created about 1,200 limited equity cooperatives that are geared towards an affordable market. Greg and I recently were able to attend Andy's induction into the Cooperative Hall of Fame. So with that said, I'd like to jump into talking to Andy, and hopefully he can give us some valuable lessons on the cooperative world. Greg, do you want to start the questioning?
Yeah, sure, Hugh. Again, welcome, Andy, and thank you again. Can you give us a brief history and overview what UHAB mission is?
Yeah, we were started almost 50 years ago. And we were started with the simple notion that, city neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods, we were started in New York City at a time when many of our neighborhoods were being abandoned, and lots of empty buildings, lots of fires, all of that. That in fact, those neighborhoods were places where people lived their lives, went to school, had jobs, got married, had families. They were places where they lived. And rather than what was common in those days, urban renewal, removing neighborhoods, the notion was that people should and could and would participate in rebuilding their neighborhoods. There were places where people's lives were centered, and they, the fabric was frayed, but it could be repaired. And so the founders of UHAB really believed in self-help and engaging people in taking control and eventually owning, which is how we came to be developing co-ops. And that one of the important ingredients that we could provide, that UHAB as an organization, was to provide the technical assistance, the training, almost in times the translation between city and other government agencies and the communities and the groups of people who wanted to fix up their own homes and own them as co-ops. Our first efforts were what we called urban homesteading, where people would take over abandoned buildings. My predecessors claimed they invented the word sweat equity. And so people with their sweat equity would clean out the buildings and in many ways rebuild those buildings and then own them as cooperatives. And UHAB evolved to provide assistance in that development process, but a lot of our assistance was in the people side of co-ops, helping the groups organize, helping them understand how to govern themselves, and developing leadership and in corporations and their bylaws and all the things that I think everybody who works with co-ops know are so important for a well-functioning and successful co-op. Many of us in the beginning were architects, and the idea of building and new housing, or renovated housing was important, but you quickly come to realize that a strong, independent people organization, a co-op organization, is really what makes for successful housing. So we think of ourselves as people developers.
Thank you, Andy. Something I know a little about. A few years ago, you developed the Six Principle Coalition. Can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I don't know, 6 years ago, maybe, I can't remember.
About.
We sort of were talking with the Ford Foundation and looking for some funding to do some co-op work. And they were interested in understanding the scope of limited equity co-ops in the nation. And so we undertook a project to find, which was not easy, and map and survey and all of that, all of the limited equity co-ops in the United States, or all that we could find. I'm sure there's some that we've missed. And there was a common understanding that there were 420,000 units of limited equity co-ops. In fact, when we looked into all of that, we discovered that, well, that was a optimistic estimate of what could have been produced. Actually, about 320,000 units were produced. And we were able to map them and survey some of them and do all of that. And we also discovered, sort of much to our alarm in a way, that about half of them were no longer limited equity. They no longer had restrictions, usually their HUD mortgage or their insurance or whatever regulations they had from HUD, because they had been around and successful for 30 or 40 years and outlived their mortgages, and now we're independent of those regulations. Many of them were still affordable, and most of them still operating really well. So we hadn't lost them as co-ops, but they no longer were limited to being affordable forever.
So Andy, just to clarify, that were they still cooperatives, just operating as market rate cooperatives, or had they transitioned to some other form of housing, or was it
right?
Some of
them,
each?
right? Some of each. Some of them. I mean, there is a notion among developers and so forth to convert to condominium. There's sort of a strange affection for condominiums as opposed to co-ops in some minds and markets. And so some of them converted, but many of them just said, oh no, we don't have any regulations anymore, but we're still a co-op. And I said, so now that you're not limited equity, how much do you sell units for? And they would say, oh, I think the last unit we sold was about $7,000. To a New Yorker's ears, that's hard. It's hardly the fee for getting in the lawyer's door. But so many of them were actually still affordable, and even the ones that, as you guys know, in New York, are still more affordable than many of the sort of truly market rate co-ops. And so we have what, 90, 100,000 units of former, HUD regulated co-ops that are out there, and they're still provide some of the more affordable housing we have in New York, homeownership opportunities. So the six, I was just saying, the Six Principle Coalition sort of grew out of these findings and the surveys, and it sort of is a plan. It's not, it exists in name, and there's a website, but it's really a business plan and a project in creation, which is to sort of be a platform, a network, a coalition of people active working with these limited equity co-ops and the co-ops themselves to meet the needs of the existing co-ops, and our survey showed what they might be, and to try to promote and provide the resources and the best practices and model documents and whatever it would take to help people interested in creating new co-ops, new limited equity co-ops, to be able to create those. And so it's an ongoing, sort of desire to be a business, to have a business plan and put it into full tuition.
So recently we've been talking about creating sort of this cooperative incubator, and is that sort of fall under the umbrella of the Six Principle Coalition?
In part, one of the results of and I think it could have happened to anybody who went out and around the country sort of talking to everybody who was involved in these co-ops, is that people started calling us, cities started calling us, groups started calling us and saying, we need some help. We want to figure out, how to put limited equity co-ops in the solutions to our housing problems. One of the things I like to say is almost every city you talk to will say no one can afford to live here anymore. Mm-hmm. And as housing prices go up, and even now with inflation and supply chain and energy costs going up, it becomes even more unaffordable. And people see limited equity co-ops, particularly cooperatives, as a model that creates affordable housing, but it creates it once, and if done right, makes it permanent, as opposed to having to recreate it every 20 or 15 or 30 years when the regulations wear out and the private developer has the opportunity to sell off those units into the private market. Then government taxpayers have to ante up again and recreate those units rather than having them stay permanently. So part of this would be that people want to learn how to do this. And so one of the ideas is to create an incubator where people can learn the finance and the physical side of building co-ops, the development side. They can learn the governance and the legal structure and all of that, and can learn sort of the ongoing stewardship, which is really one of the most important parts of creating a co-op. Is you can't sort of build it and walk away, but there needs to be an ongoing way of supporting the co-op as generations turn over, as the conditions, as we've seen recently, cities change, the economy changes, ongoing support, as well as making sure people live up to the restrictions, to the promises that they made about affordability at the beginning, even when their neighborhood becomes one of the most desirable neighborhoods, in a city, that they're still offering affordable opportunities to households when they need them, when they're done living in their co-op. So yeah, the incubator is an outgrowth of this. It would be a project that UHAB would take on and would need the cooperation from in a large part the resources that NAHC brings, which is this wealth of skilled, experienced sort of co-op professionals, the managers, the developers, the bankers, attorneys and accountants. That was something our survey showed that people were really desperate for, is they didn't know where to find an accountant who understood co-op accounting, or they didn't have a lawyer who was well versed in co-ops and the law of a particular state to amend their documents. So so having that at the ready as part of this undertaking is also one of the things that we learned in our surveying.
Yeah, it's really interesting right now. Just the overall environment on the national level for co-op housing, cooperative housing. We're seeing it at NAHC, and the nonprofit world has started to look to it as a model, creating long-term affordability, and so have local governmental jurisdictions. And even in my experience, the social justice movement has really impacted the desire for cooperative housing as a means to help take back communities and create a more cohesive community. So it's a really interesting time to be involved in the co-op movement, in my opinion. And I know that you recently have branched out outside of New York City, and can you talk about that experience a little bit? I know you're active in projects in Maine and Washington State, and probably some other areas. Can you talk about that experience?
Sure. I think as you just mentioned, people get interested in this and they start looking around for somebody who can come and speak to them. It may be a community group, maybe a local community development corporation that does rental housing. It may be a local government, a city council member. In Maine, it started with some community groups that were involved in sort of citizen action, also groups that represented immigrants and were trying to meet their housing needs. And they worked to get the city council in Portland, Maine to become very interested. There is Rise Up is already a co-op group in Lewiston, Maine, and they came and lent their experience and expertise, and city council made land available and chose cooperative projects on 2 sites, and then actually added a 3rd site. And so those projects are going forward and will be new co-ops. Seattle, in many ways, was the same. A city council member said, we pass a housing levy every couple years, I think, and they wanted to add co-ops as one of the eligible housing entities. And they had us come and speak and do a workshop for a day and speak along with a community land trust group from Los Angeles. And in the end, they changed the law so co-ops could be part of it. And there's a group building, as you know, a co-op in Seattle, and other groups around the state have also expressed interest. The city of Oakland has a co-op program that we're working with them. It wasn't long ago that I was asked to testify by Zoom, quite easy, at the San Francisco City Council, where we had worked on co-ops many years ago, but they hadn't built any new ones in a while and were interested. And in Washington, DC, we all know that has a history of co-ops, and a city council member and a whole task force who have really worked on this co-op issue. So it's like that in many places. It comes from local groups and from local government.
Mm-hmm. I just learned this past week that Washington State, the state legislature, passed a law providing limited equity cooperatives well, they're not calling it this because it has to be renewed every 15 years, but it's a permanent real estate tax abatement to help spur new development and for limited equity cooperatives. So that's a real boost. And I think as governments see, local and state governments see the benefits of the cooperative housing and do stuff like that, it's just going to help create momentum on the new development side for sure.
Right.
So.
Right. It's budget season in New York State, and there is a $1 billion limited equity co-op bill in there. What comes out in the budget doesn't always reflect what's going around, but it's a really good and hopeful sign. And we hear similar things are going on in California. So yeah, it's a model whose time has come many times, but come again. And that's the purpose of all of this, is to be ready to offer sort of the experience of the people who've been doing it. I mean, we have some experience, but you guys have your own experiences, and the folks who built and maintained those 320,000, 150,000 units of co-ops out there need to be identified and tapped and made ready to help with this.
Yep. Speaking of, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, because we're on this thread, what we've been talking about, and all of us know, is really the localities and or the states that have been doing this. What do we, and we both, I think we all would agree that we need a national plan, something from Washington, D.C. on a national basis. What do you think is needed to have that national plan?
Well, I mean, as we know, there have been some small efforts to put some things in the Build Back Better, but you know, HUD used to have a robust co-op programs. Many of them sort of still exist on paper. They were designed for a different time, so a lot of changes need to be made. But our experience over the years is when HUD makes financing available for co-ops, encourages co-ops, has staff that understand co-ops and can make sure the programs accommodate the differences between co-ops and rental housing, because they develop in different ways, and especially as you get to the end and you have to sell units and do all those things, they go forward differently. It sparks groups, you know, state and local, to undertake co-op projects. Each time we've gone around the nation and worked with groups, each time we've seen these large, you know, growth in co-ops. A lot of it is spurred by federal programs. So a loan program, being clear about the availability of Section 8 to help subsidize, you know, the individuals who can't afford what is an affordable co-op, and maybe making some of the other things available like tax credits and so forth to work for home ownership for co-ops, as well as you know, for rental housing, would be good, and you know, and making sure there's adequate funding to make it work. I mean, the one thing that we have to be very careful of, and it happens with sort of each new sort of flavor, and it could be mutual housing associations, or it could be community land trusts, and it can be co-ops. There's no magic in making housing affordable through those mechanisms. What those do, actually, all three of them, is they make your initial investment permanent. You can count on it generation after generation, but it still takes subsidy. If it costs more to build housing and to run it than many people can afford, you need to subsidize that housing so that it's affordable to those people. And that's what government does best. So that's what we would count on from them is, but they need they need somebody who's a champion of co-ops. I think they should have an office of co-ops in the White House, because it's not just the cooperative business model, but we have the credit unions and the farm co-ops, and I mean, it's a big sector, and and all of those are enjoying a resurgence as well, and interest. So I think the White House needs to recognize this and try to coordinate those efforts.
So you mentioned Build Back Better, and you and I and Paul Bradley were able to help craft some of the language. How was that program? How would that work?
The idea of that, it was Congresswomen Maloney and Omar were the chief sponsors of it when it came out. It provided sort of funding grants, essentially, for nonprofit groups to sort of do the pre-development to create a co-op, to sort of help with the burden of sort of working capital and equity during the development of a co-op, because you don't have that from the future owners. And then it provided, which was, I thought, a very good and interesting concept, which is continued to provide grants to the nonprofit during the first 10 or 15 years of the operation of the co-op, to provide that stewardship that is so important to get the co-op off and running on a really good footing, and on into sort of being a strong and functioning co-op organization. And I think recognizing right from the beginning that support and stewardship is part of the cost of running and operating a good co-op is important, so that it's underwritten in. And this had it as grants, and we always like grants. And it was coupled with the FHA co-op programs, which do exist. They're seem to be mostly run from the Minneapolis office, correct? And
That's correct.
And you know, it would be nice, and it was a demonstration program. So what it would allow Congress to do, and for the participants to do, is after doing this for a couple years, to begin saying, oh, you know, we did this and it would work much better if the limits on this were this, or if the cost of this was covered, or whatever. I mean, that's what demonstration programs are there to do, to you know, put some models on the ground and then evaluate them to see how you can make things better. And so it I think was there in Congress, and it sort of died with the with the large Build Back Better. But we can only hope that if there's a moment when everybody can take a breath and say, we really need to work on this housing issue, it will, or something like it will come forward.
Oh, yeah, well, I keep hoping someone or something will resurrect Build Back
Right.
Better and get it moving.
Right.
But I'm not holding my breath on that at this point, but we're still working towards it.
Yeah.
So so we're running a little short on time, and I want to
Right.
be aware of that. But you know, just to wrap up, I you know, you have provided you've been volunteering on the NAHC Development and Preservation Committee for the past several years, and that has your experience has been invaluable to us. And I just want you to reflect a bit on that, and you know, talk about how NAHC and UHAB can work together to raise awareness for housing cooperatives, and in particular limited equity cooperatives.
Right. Well, I should say it is not there, you know, doing this is really important, because this is how I learned what I know about co-ops, is coming to NAHC, you know, learning from Roger and everybody else who was involved in co-ops in those days, and hearing the tales and sort of, you know, honing my skills. And so it's something I think we all need to do, is sort of pass that on. And I think it's important as a way. I mean, we really need to work to make sure that we have a new generation of co-op practitioners who come and learn. And I think NAHC has the national you know, footprint and reach, and needs to be the natural place where people come when they're looking for learning about co-ops and so forth, and sort of you know, and it also, as its members, represents a very large portion of all of those limited equity co-ops, as well as many other co-ops that are not restricted, but in lots of places, and even a little bit in New York, you know, not limited equity co-ops also provide affordable housing, and an opportunity for home ownership. So I think that's important. You know, I think the you know, conference is an important place to learn. I think the regional network is a good place for people to find out, and particularly for co-ops to get the support they need and to find the services they need. And I think on sort of national advocacy things, having a voice, a national voice, is really important. It's something that we as sort of more localized groups, even if we're sort of working nationally, just don't have that voice and authority and so forth. So I think that's important. And then to sort of work, if we're going to do a national kind of incubator, having a national partner is really important to that, and getting the involvement of everybody who's engaged in this work across the nation is going to be helpful to sort of get their insights. I mean, our goal was that we fortuitously have been supported by first the federal government and then city government, and back and forth for almost 50 years. And we have a lot of experience. It's uniquely New York, but it means something. We have a lot of materials. We have a lot of stuff, intellectual property, as we like to call it. And we need to share it because it's doing nobody any good in our files and locked in our computer server and all the rest of it. So and in the heads of some of our older employees. So that's what we're going about doing.
Okay, well, great. Thanks for being here, Andy. I think it was really helpful and enlightening, and we're excited to continue to work with you. And Greg, I'm going to give you the final word, if you don't mind.
I get the final word.
You get the final word. So,
all right. Thank you, Andy. And I just want to bring up something very short. Yesterday, Hugh, I, and others of the Government Relations Committee did have a conversation with the Deputy Secretary of Multifamily Housing and HUD. And it was a short meeting, but we did get our points across. Many of the points is what you have pointed out, including filling the vacancy of the Assistant Commissioner for Co-op Housing. So we thought that would be a great start. So I think we're all on the same page, and I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your thoughts and inspiration. And for that, I'll hand it back to you to give you the big wave.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.